Let's get straight to the point with views from both sides of the aisle. We now welcome Austin Barber and Brandon Jones to our MPB studios. Austin is a Republican strategist and founder of the Clearwater Group. Brandon is an attorney and former Democratic member of the Mississippi House of Representatives. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hey.
All right, so the issue this week is these dueling, competing methodologies of funding education. The Senate on Thursday went ahead and passed a kind of tweaking of the MAEP with with full funding of that new formula. The House earlier in the week offered the Inspire Act, which kind of scraps the MAEP and creates a new formula. Does not have an objective component to it like the MAEP does. So I guess big picture first, why the both chambers are taking up this issue, being very, very public about it. I mean, prioritizing it. Where did this come from, especially in Republican supermajority chambers, when it seems like for years we've heard the cries from the Democratic Party that education funding need to be addressed. So, Austin, I'll start with you. Why? I mean, we've talked about education before. Why now, when it comes to really hammering ed funding?
Well, you asked this question, where did this come from? I've said a lot of times on this program and over the years, as I've had a chance to sit down with Brandon and debate these issues with him, that I really believe that Republicans have owned this issue of education, reforming education from a policy perspective to more money into the system. I feel like Republicans have owned this for the last 10 years. And for most of my lifetime, Republicans haven't owned this issue. And so where did this come from? This is Republican leadership. This is Dennis DeBoer, who's the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, and Delbert Hosemann, who, of course, is the lieutenant governor. And then on the House side, Rob Robertson, who's the chairman of the House Education Committee, and the Speaker, Jason White, saying, in their own caucuses, in their own chambers, we want to do more for education. Let's continue the Mississippi Miracle, which Governor Reeves always talks about, which, of course, is the dramatically improved scores throughout Mississippi education with our kids, with our students, And so what can we do to put more into this? This is what you got to remember, okay? And I've heard both sides debate it on Thursday, which is they both want to put a little more than $200 million into it. They got their own ways to want to do it. The House has this bold plan where they're saying I won't get into the details, we'll do a follow-up for that, but I want to go 100,000 foot. They both want to put a lot more money this year, general fund dollars, into education. Senate is about $250 million, House is, $200 to $225 million. So that's how I look at it. That's how I describe it. They both have their own ways to do it, but they're both continuing to do more good things on the education front.
Well, Brandon, when you hear him saying that this is something Republicans have always wanted to do, well, you served.
It was since 2012 when Republicans gerrymandered the Mississippi legislature into oblivion. They've owned every issue. They've had supermajority since then. So you own roads, you own hospitals, you own schools, you own everything because you gerrymandered into supermajority. So of course you own it. But when I was there, we couldn't find a Republican with an all-points bulletin to vote in favor of full funding. So I'm happy to welcome Mississippi Republicans into the conversation on public schools and on supporting them. We have to do it. And I'm glad they're here. And look, we've talked about before, a lot of these things that have passed in the last several years have come with full bipartisan support. Today's Senate bill that we're talking about passed with 100% support. Every Democrat in the Senate chamber voted in favor of the Senate bill. So, I think who owns it? We own our public education as a state, and we all have to put our backs to the wheel to make it work. I am curious about this. I mean, we have seen sometimes whenever new legislative leaders get elected, they try to do a lot of things. That's not uncommon. Like, I have this job.
It's natural.
It's natural. And I'm at the point of the session now where I'm wondering if Speaker White's eyes might be bigger than his stomach. It's like, okay, we're taking on the ballot initiative. We're taking on MAEP. We're taking on Medicaid expansion. We're taking on PERS. It's item after item after item. There's a lot
But that's not a bad thing.
Well, it just depends. It depends on what the outcome is. I think in this case, we've talked about before, taking on this formula that's been in effect for some decades, I don't think it's a sacred cow. I don't think it's an issue that can't be touched. I think there's bipartisan agreement. You can look at this. I mean, again, Senate seems to have something that appeals to both parties. So I think you can do something. I think where they're running into problems with the House bill is sort of like, what's the foundation of this? Because if you do a repeal and replace, if you do a we're taking away MAEP and we're replacing it with something, that's going to be a tougher hill to climb. And there's some questions about the basis of that. But in the Senate, it's to your point, Michael, a moment ago, they're keeping MAEP in place. They're just amending it. And I feel like that's probably more palatable to everybody because at least there's some familiarity.
Yeah, and if you're going to do something that's transformational, and changing the formula is transformational, and it's a big deal, and every administrator, every teacher is going, how's this going to affect me? Of course, that is going to require a lot of debate and a lot of eyes and a lot of conversation about it. And it may not happen this session. And it may happen this session because, you know, it's a priority of the speaker. On Thursday, we heard him talking about it in his own press conference.
Yeah. And to the point there, the Dennis DeBar, when presenting the bill in the Senate chamber, pointed out the influences behind the Inspire Act, the House's Inspire Act, you know, bringing up the names of you know, think tanks that, you know, that he, by his own words, were heavily involved in the House's creation of that bill, and lauding at the same time his own, you know, relationships with MDE and Elbow and drafting and crafting their legislation. So you're talking about what's more palatable. I mean, when we talk about, you know, the Senate saying that their plan, what they're presenting, is something that's gone through MDE, it's gone through the Legislative Budget Office, it's been well vetted, and casting the other bill as something that's influenced by outside factors. Well, you know, is that going to play into the politics of all of this?
Well, both things can be true at the same time. I mean, of course, and look, again, I go back to this. Both of these chairmen, both of the leaders of these bodies, they want to get more money into K through 12 education. Had record amounts of funding, and they want to put even more money into it. They just have these different visions of how to do it. When Dennis DeBar says, chairman of education, the Senate says, hey, this has been vetted by MDE and the budget office. Yes, all those things are true because it's been in place for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. More than 20 years. MAEP formula's been in place for that long. But it also,
sadly, since you and I were in high school, I think is when it got cranky. In the 90s.
I'm older than you. But I was in high school in the 90s, thankfully. You totally distracted me, but that was worth it. But then of course, it can also be true that what Speaker White and Chairman Rob Robertson, Kent McCarty, these individuals in the House are pushing, can also be true that it can do things that would be positive for K through 12 education. In the House, and I sort of asked a couple of members, boil this down to me. What's the real difference in this? And the House says, you know, well, ours is student-focused funding, all right? For every student, there's a set amount of dollars, okay? $6,650, whatever the dollar amount is. I think it's $6,550. And then for each kid who is, you know, maybe has special needs, maybe lives in rural Mississippi, maybe English is their second language, they're in the sort of career technical education programs, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other levers that can be flipped. We'll add dollars on top of it.
Right.
Okay? So what the House is saying is, look, if the Inspire Act passed, every kid's got a certain dollar amount tagged to them. We're going to write a check each year, and we're going to fully fund this program each year.
I'm glad you brought that up because I want to pivot to Brandon on this. When you hear things like this student-centered thing and having this number attached to a student, and you think about the influential, you know, groups involved in the drafting of the Inspire Act, the Center for Public Policy, Empower, groups that have been strongly vocal about implementing school choice. Do you, as a Democrat, Brandon, see the nuts and bolts of the Inspire Act as a potential foundation for further push for school choice? We're not hearing school choice in the Inspire Act, but is it setting the table?
Yeah. Well, so when we talk about base student cost, which is this idea that there's a cost associated with what it costs to educate a child, that's an MAEP concept. Mm-hmm. That's what the MAEP is. It's this idea that there's a cost per child, and then that cost is adjusted up depending on SPED, depending on English as a second language, depending on poverty considerations, depending on a host of other
Yeah.
things, inflation, that you would increase that number for. The argument that you heard Representative Robert Johnson make on Thursday morning is that in speaking with ELBO, the Legislative Budget Office, and speaking with the Department of Education, they couldn't account for where the House folks got their numbers, which is the distinction to Dennis DeBar, who, if we want to talk about approaches here, Dennis DeBar, Greene County, who's been in this job now for 5 years, he has made himself a student of the Mississippi educational process, has gone across the state on listening tours with superintendents and with teachers. And I do tend to, if you ask me who do you trust among the people who are fashioning legislation, DeBar would be there because he's made it his priority. When you talk about people who have, as a policy matter, been committed to the destabilization of public schools, like the Mississippi Center for Public Policy or Empower, of course you don't trust that they're going in a direction to help K through 12 funding.
But I got to push back
Austin, go ahead.
on my friend to my left here. Yeah, I mean, of course I trust Dennis DeBar, but I also trust Jason White, and I trust Delbert Hoseman, and I trust Rob Robertson, that they are wanting to do what they think is best for public education. So, you know, I heard Rob Robertson answer questions from a member of the press about, where did you get this information? This was on Thursday morning. And he specifically said, I talked to boom and boom and boom. So listen, this is what I really wanted to push back on you. When you say that there are these groups that are trying to destabilize public schools, I totally disagree with you on that. And you didn't even say what groups, but I imagine I know what groups you're talking about. And I may not agree with everything that they may talk about, but I am a believer in school choice, because I do not think, and I'll just say this at 100,000 foot, Brandon, I do not think that it is fair for a child to be stuck in a failing school district just because of the zip code that they live in and not have alternative options to that. I also do not think, I have not heard this, that the Inspire Act is just the first piece to then shred, let kids go wherever school they want to. Jackson Academy or whatever school that they want to do that. I haven't heard nothing about that.
And that's the fear, that it's a Trojan horse for these groups that have plans beyond public education. I mean, that's the fear. Look, when we talk about stylistic approaches, I do think it's worth saying we already have a lieutenant governor who likes to put his fingers on everything. He likes every bill to be this big issue, Delbert's version. And now it sounds like we've got a House Speaker who's like, well, I kind of want to put my fingers on everything. It could be good for those of us who would like everybody to slow down and maybe not tinker and overhaul everything, because what we probably are heading toward is a standoff between a fairly mild tweaking of the program in the Senate and an overhaul in the House. They're going to go into conference, and I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with either nothing or something closer to what the Senate's proposed.
Yeah, that's where the last place I wanted to take this, because the way that this is developing is reminiscent of the teacher pay raise a couple years ago. That both chambers put out their plan, and they passed it, resoundingly. And then when it got to the other chamber, we saw strike alls, and it was just strike all amendment, insert their own language and send it back, and ended up in conference. I mean, it's this. I imagine that the other chamber's bill is dead on arrival in the opposite chamber, and are we just it's just going to go to conference, and then we'll determine there if we're actually going to see any real funding changes?
That's a mighty negative way to say that they're dead on arrival. But yeah, both chambers thoroughly believe in what they're doing on education, and they both are going to stand behind what they want to do as long as they possibly can. But I heard Jason White, I heard him say Thursday morning in his press conference, nothing but nice things. He said nothing but nice things about the Senate and their position and what they want to do, and that he realizes that through negotiations and compromise that they would continue to work on this issue, but also know this is a priority to him. I mean, this is not just one of 1,000 priorities. I think this is right there at the top of the list. So
he's not a jerk. That helps.
Hey,
Yeah.
That helps.
Well,
He's very likable.
And as someone who's been in
That's
that
true,
chamber, Brandon, I mean, like how important is it to the body? You know, when something finally passes, that it has that HB or SB next to it.
Now, it just depends on the member. I mean, there's been institutional pride at different times. There's been partisan pride at different times. There used to be pride in taking on a governor if you were in the legislative branch. So we see it in different ways. So it varies in terms of that type of intensity. I think the best members, the ones that end up doing the most good, are the ones who are just there for, let's figure out a way to do something that's meaningful, and let's not worry about where it originates or who it's titled or who the sponsor is. But those folks are rare. I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of legacy building going on over there at the legislature. But I will say this, culture matters. And that's why I mentioned that Jason's not a jerk, and that's just kind of a pithy way of saying he's a nice guy. And I do think he sincerely desires decent relationships with the members of his chamber. And I think he wants to have a decent relationship with the Senate and with Delbert Hosemann.
And the governor.
And that is no small thing. I mean, that will make him an effective operator. And let's face it, we've had some folks who are fairly obstinate and difficult. It's nice, I think, as a change of pace to have someone who appears to be open to relationships. So that's not a small thing. But kind of going back to the substance of the education overhaul, I said this before, and I still think this. Every time that we've broached the subject of changing MAEP, we've been told, even by conservative experts, that this is something that takes a while and that you would have to do some real substantive study in that number, Austin, about what does it cost to educate a child? What is that true base number, and how does it change if you're in Jackson County as opposed to DeSoto County? I think the problem that we have with the House bill is when we say, show us your work, as math teachers would say to me, and I would crawl under my desk, there's no work here. It's like, take us at our word, or I think it's a good number. And that's where the problematic part comes in for the House bill.
I'm sure they have plenty of worksheets where they can show their work. There's no way. I mean, they couldn't just come up with this like, oh, this just sounds great. Let's go with this.
Austin's confidence in people in the process.
Well, I try. I try. You know, I'm going to give people the benefit of the doubt until they're proven wrong. Hey, look, this thing's headed to conference. Okay,
Right.
That's where this is. We'll be discussing this at the very end of the session. I just don't see a pathway forward right now for either side to go, yep, taking yours. I mean, it's
Right.
just too important to both of them. And more debate on this is a good thing.
Okay. I'd like to go ahead and quick pivot. Medicaid expansion, just briefly. The Senate chair, Medicaid chair, is saying this week is saying no work requirement, no expansion. That is going to, the House bill has a work requirement, but also kind of written in there that if CMS, declines that waiver, that it'll go ahead. How long can the Senate hold this position?
The House appears, as opposed to the conversation we just had, the House appears to have done its homework on its bill.
Okay.
Now, it has baked into its bill a work requirement, which is apparently very important to conservative members of the Mississippi legislature. It also has baked into its bill a requirement for some premium contribution from people. Those are the big issues that come up nationwide. So whenever the Senate says, well, we have to have those things, the obvious retort to that is, well, the House bill has those things. So what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And then the Senate passed a dummy bill, and I'll be quick.
It's okay.
The Senate passed a dummy bill that brings these code sections forward, but hasn't shown us their plan yet. Well, that's a little bit problematic because I do think they have something to work with the House plan. But this goes back to something I said a moment ago. Lieutenant Governor Hosemann is a consummate tinkerer. He likes to get his fingers on this. If you had asked me 5 years ago, who's the most likely person over there to pass Medicaid expansion, it's Delbert Hosemann, because he campaigned on it 5 years ago. So the fact that now we're this many years into the debate, and now we have a bill from the House, he's finally got a dance partner, and we're getting code sections, is a little bit like, come on, Senate, let's get the bat off our shoulders. I mean, you've had enough time to look at this.
Okay, so I think there's a part of the House bill, and y'all can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, that if I don't know if it's the judicial branch of the federal government or the executive branch of the federal government say no, the work
DHS.
Okay, there you go. The work requirement, sorry, that doesn't cut it. it's not, not constitutional. We're not going to, whatever whatever it is.
It's a waiver request.
Yeah. So
exactly.
if they remove that, if that's denied, if the work requirement is denied, does that kill the House? Does that kill in the House bill, is the expansion program killed and not implemented, or can it still go forward? And we just not have a work requirement.
No, the House bill allows. Does
it allow for expansion if the work requirement's terminated?
Yes, it does.
Okay, so I think
which is kind of in the mainstream.
I think that is the sticking point. I think that's the problem in the Senate. This is my gut. Is that you're not going to have. You certainly won't have a problem because this is what we're talking about here. If the Senate just goes, we're going to take the House bill. Goes to the governor. The governor is, I just cannot imagine that, I'm not talking to him or anybody on his staff about this. I cannot imagine that he would sign that piece, or he would even just not sign it. He's going to veto that, is my gut. If it says, okay, the work requirement was denied, but Medicaid expansion still happens. So then you're just going to, where's the veto vote?
And isn't this question, isn't that what this is really all about? Like, the House seems to have
Can they override
numbers,
his veto?
but it's really
of
the
course it
question
is.
of can the Senate override the veto?
And that's why I think this is really going down to the Senate. So the Senate may pass a bill, or they may try to get something out of conference that says, okay, this only goes into law if the work requirement is approved. I just think that's the sticking point on this, is my gut. Again, I haven't talked to anybody specifically about that. And then it's just, there's the veto vote in the Senate. I would think that they've got a veto majority in the House. And they may end up in the Senate as well. I think that is the sticking point. Sorry. Took me a little while to get that out, but
all good. All right. Well, it's something we'll continue to watch, but just interesting that the Senate, at least of this week, Senate Chair Kevin Blackwell, Medicaid Chair Kevin Blackwell, is still sticking with his no work requirement, no expansion line. And I'm just, well, I guess as the session goes on, we'll see if he has to budge on that.
Notable that both chambers of the Mississippi legislature have passed legislation that could potentially, allow for a close of the coverage gap in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a historic thing. So.
Yeah. Last thing, real quick, a Senate bill, kind of an omnibus bill, and it's being presented and touted as campaign finance reform. But the nuts and bolts of the bill, I mean, as we've kind of discussed previously, it's really just kind of outlines enforcement methods, enforcement penalties, things like that. Doesn't really change much about campaign financing in Mississippi. So I'll just start with you, Austin. What's your take on this bill? Why this huge package? Like I said, an omnibus bill almost of Senate. Of campaign finance, legislation that you kind of have already said it's not really reform. It's just let's just put some things in place.
It's a long bill,
yeah,
that I haven't looked all the way through. But here's what I can tell you: Jeremy England's the chairman of elections in the Senate. He's the author of this bill.
Let me guess, you like him?
I do like him.
Yeah,
he's a good guy. You should like him too. He's from Jackson County.
Good guy.
He is one of the sort of the rising stars of the younger members in the Senate. Look, as a guy who's done plenty of campaign stuff in Mississippi, it's pretty loosey-goosey in terms of reporting. And I think a lot of this is going towards reporting. When people are like, what are you talking about reporting? Reporting is each campaign or each political action committee has to disclose who their donors are.
Yeah.
And if Brandon Jones is one of my donors, I'm supposed to write on a piece of paper, Brandon Jones, this is his address. He gave me $200 or whatever he gave me, and I'm supposed to turn that in with every other donor, plus I have to go write all of my expenses in a legible way and turn that in, for the deadlines to the Secretary of State's office. Yeah. Then the Secretary of State's office publishes it online so the public and all the opponents in these races can go look at it and see what's going on. And there's not much enforcement going on this side.
When you say there's not much enforcement of what? What's not being enforced?
It's not the Secretary of State's office. It's fault, I promise you. I mean, I have seen in municipal races, I've seen in statewide races, I've seen in legislative races, you just get these reports that are turned in late, never turned in. You can't read what's written on there.
Even written in crayon sometimes.
Written in, scribble that you just can't even figure out what it is. There always appears that nothing's ever really done.
Right.
And again, I'm sure the Secretary of State's office would say, well, we don't have, there's really no teeth in the law that gives us much power to do this. And listen, Jeremy's bill could have a whole lot of other stuff in it, but I'm just sort of talking about the disclosure aspect. I don't think he fundamentally changes anything regarding who can give, how much they can give.
There's not much of that in there. It's really the enforcement piece of it. It seems to really,
It may clarify that an out-of-state corporation has the same donor limits that an in-state corporation should, which that's common sense.
Yes.
There was some ambiguity towards that, but it needs to be clarified.
Well, so this enforcement piece. I mean, I think this, this desire to at least like publicly show that the legislature is addressing campaign finance enforcement comes on the heels of a pretty testy primary campaign between the lieutenant governor and his challenger, Chris McDaniel. How much is that playing into this?
I guess a lot. Mississippi is the Wild West in terms of campaign finance enforcement. We had a member of the Senate session or two ago who didn't file a campaign finance report for 4 years. And it was reported on year after year, and I don't even know if they ever did anything about it. We have a legislature that has exempted itself from open records laws and open meetings laws. In Mississippi, a super PAC can coordinate with a candidate without any restriction, which is odd. That's
Are you
odd.
sure about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
there's no law.
I've run super PACs in Mississippi, and I've never coordinated with a campaign.
Well, I don't think you should, and same here. But I don't think there's a prohibition against
the
it.
spirit of the federal law.
The federal law is.
Are you sure about that?
Well, it depends on how your PAC is organized.
But why would you? This is good because we got two political
coordination.
Yeah, go for
But
this.
why would you, at a state level, why would you ever need a super PAC? Because you can take unlimited funds. You can take unlimited dollars. So, I mean, most people go set up a super PAC at the federal level because federal campaign contribution limits are capped. So they say, well, I got someone who wants to give me $1 million, go start a super PAC, and that money goes into there. You don't need that at the state level.
It's an example of an area of law that states have passed legislation that mirrors federal law.
Yeah.
Mississippi has done very little of that. That's just one of those areas. We don't have a searchable database of campaign finance records.
That
which
was
is
a piece of
that
this bill that got
taken out
by the.
Sounded like a bipartisan assassination of that line.
Yeah.
So look, I say all that to say it is an issue. Michael, you're right to point out that it was an issue during the Republican primary. It was an issue during the general election. Democratic gubernatorial candidate Brandon Presley had a big plan on campaign finance reform and lobbying reform, all those types of things.
And so did the Democratic candidate for AG.
And so,
putting Presley hits his own issues, because then it goes back to he was a member of the Public Service Commission. They can't take money from people who they regulate, and then it was this argument: is he taking money from people he regulates or not? So both sides, have their own issues of reporting and all this stuff. So I'm glad.
I think that's immaterial, though, to whether or not people should have good laws. I mean, I'm just mentioning the context that this comes out of.
There's the good laws, and then
I'm not gonna lead with the I don't think we should have good laws side of this.
so
that's a failing argument.
Well, you mentioned there's the law, but the law has to be enforced, and I think a big piece of this is that at least during this past election cycle, you had the Secretary of State's office and the AG's office kind of like doing this dance of who's going to enforce this, and does this resolve some of that?
That's the intent. I know from Senate England's standpoint, what he hopes to do is to give the Secretary of State more authority to be able to act in these situations.
That's a good thing.
I think the Secretary of State wants that authority. Yeah. We have a long history in Mississippi of giving the Secretary of State. I mean, that's a fiefdom over there. We have given that office. They're looking at sports contracts. They're checking your business license. They're going to check your campaign finance. I mean, that's a jack of all trades office. And they also want to do searchable campaign finance records, which I think would be a good thing. Look, it's good to have this conversation. We should have campaign finance reform conversations, but I think we should be clear, and I think we have been. This isn't really reform. This is more about enforcement of laws we already
It'll
have.
be fun to watch this debate throughout the session.
Yeah. And this is obviously something, politicians are going to be heavily invested in. Does the electorate care about this?
No.
Okay.
They do. They do. I
Go,
think so.
go poll it. Go poll it and find out.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do something about it.
Right.
No,
No,
they
I know.
don't. No, they don't. No, they
care.
don't. Around the country, it's not just Mississippi. They do not care. They think whatever they think. They're more worried about taxes and education and health care and is my daggum road paid.
How you frame it is important. They care who pays for their politician. They care who pays to put their person in office.
Go find real. We're way over the deadline here, but go find real campaigns that truly talk about this and it moves numbers in campaigns. That doesn't mean that. Oh, I don't care. I mean, yes, you said it. Have good laws. Don't look at me like that.
People care about it. They
don't
care about it. It's all in
it.
how you frame it. It's all in how you frame it. And whether
It's not way up there.
let me be the policy person that says whether it polls high in Mississippi or not.
America.
There's a great point for having solid campaign finance laws
yes.
because you need to know who is the person that's pulling the tab for the people who are getting elected and those types of things.
You
matter.
said this, and I agreed with you, that we should have strong laws on this. The Secretary of State wanting strong laws and Jeremy England, that's the right thing to do. But he asked a different question. Okay.
All right. And that will be the last question. This has been At Issue on MPB Think Radio, a weekly discussion about the 2024 legislative session. If you can't catch us live each Friday at 6:30, At Issue can be streamed on demand on the MPB Public Media app, or you can subscribe to the At Issue podcast. Each week's podcast includes an extended version of our weekly interview, as well as an extended version of our roundtable discussion. And if you'd like to see what we all look like, the full interview and roundtable are available on YouTube. Just search Mississippi Public Broadcasting At Issue. I'm Michael Guidry for all of us at MPB. Thanks for listening.